Well, welcome. I think we're ready to go. I'll say again, a good morning to all of you. Perhaps I'll start with those that are joining us virtually. We're really delighted to have you, and glad that you can be with us from wherever you are, in whatever time zone or place that you are. This is truly a global program that we're in, and we're delighted that you all can join us from there as well. And I'd also like to welcome very warmly those of you who've joined us here in person. Because of course it's all so nice to see the audience. So we'll imagine many more, as well as appreciate those of you here. Very much like to welcome all of you as well, our panelists in particular, who've come from near and far to be with us here in Washington, D.C. At this beautiful time of year. And so glad you could be with us for our conversations as well. My name is Lara Smith. I am a political scientist. I'm the director of the African Studies program here at Georgetown, and I've had the pleasure of working on this initiative with my colleagues for a number of years now, and have learned so much in the process. Not my area of specialty, but certainly one that I care deeply about as a global citizen, and feel really honored to have the opportunity to learn from the experts in these over these years. So really thank the person who brought this to us, Dr. Yoon Jung Park, for that and for the learning and friendship that we've developed, as well as those who are leading this research working group today, which is focused on Africa, China in Africa's digital transformation, Dr. Anita Plummer and Dr. Ken Opalo, and really looking forward to the work that we'll do today as well. They will introduce our panel in a moment, so I'm not overlooking the importance of that personal work, but I'll leave that to others. I'd like to introduce my colleague, Dr. Park, who will do some acknowledgements for those who've helped to make today and other work possible.
Hi, everyone. I echo my colleague Lara Smith's welcome. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Yoon Jung Park. I'm the program director for the Africa-China Initiative here at Georgetown. The Africa-China Initiative is in its going on its fourth year now at Georgetown. We are hosted by African Studies with colleagues and support from Asian Studies as well. We've been hosting an event series for, I think, going on 6, maybe 7 semesters now at Georgetown. And the event series is both in person as well as virtual. And we're here to bring field-based empirical research on Chinese engagement in Africa to Washington, D.C., Georgetown, and global audiences. Given all of the things that are happening around the world right now, we think it's really important to ensure that conversations around Africa, China, and the world are informed by real evidence-based research. So this is our major goal. This is the first time that, in addition to just general events, that we've hosted a research working group. And this first group, our guinea pigs, several of whom you'll be hearing from today, have been doing work on a really, really important topic. I'll leave it to my colleague, Anita Plummer, to talk to you more about that. I just wanted to also give thanks to our event series partners, the Initiative for U.S.-China Dialogue on Global Issues, as well as the Center for African Studies at Howard University, for always being so supportive and helping us to bring these events to light. None of this would be possible without the generous support from the Henry Luce Foundation, and our research working group in particular has had some generous funding from Georgetown's own Office for Global Engagement. So we wanted to thank Tom Banchoff in particular for his support. So let me then hand over to Professor Plummer, and she'll introduce the panel and tell you a little bit more about the research working group.
Thanks, Yoon. We're running a little bit behind. So I think the working group's important work will be reflected in the presentations of the panel. I do want to acknowledge 2 panelists that aren't presenting today, and that's Hong Wei Li of the German Institute of Development and Sustainability, and Isaac Odum from Carleton University, in addition to the other co-convener, Ken Opalo of Georgetown University, and myself. So with that said, the working group convened a year ago. There was an open call for papers for scholars looking at Africa's engagement with China and vice versa, looking at tech and digital engagements on differing scales. And we wanted, as Yoon said, for there to be evidence-based research. And there were a number of different scholars that responded to the call. So it was hard for us to pull together and select the group that in the end came together, but the group that came together was very rich. And we spent yesterday, I think 8-9 hours together just workshopping very rich content, very rich discussions. And today's panel reflects some of that work, but the panelists have been working for quite a few years on this research topic. So we're very pleased to be able to present some of their work. So we'll begin with Bulalani Jilly of Harvard University, who will present on Between Dependency and Independence, African Agency Amid China's Expanding Digital Footprint in Africa. He'll be followed by Yabo Wu of Maastricht University, Exporting the China Model, Two Chinese Technology Firms in Kenya's Digital Development. She'll be followed by Mandira Bhagwandeen of Stellenbosch University, Huawei, Helping or Hindering African Countries Secure Their Data Sovereignty. And then finally, Ibrahima Niang, University of Sheikh Anta Diop University, rewriting the future of digital in Senegal. Can the Huawei model fit the Senegalese New Deal technology? So without further ado, each of the panelists will speak for about 10 minutes, and then we'll open it up for a moderated Q&A. So Bulalani, if you'll start us off.
Yeah, sure. Firstly, hello, everybody. And thank you so much for being here and willing to offer your attention to us today. So today, I will really principally be discussing with you the proliferation of Chinese surveillance technologies into Africa, with a particular focus on Kenya. And some of you here and virtually might be wondering why Kenya? In part because it has received some of the largest ICT loans from China. By ICT, I simply mean information communication technologies. And so these are systems that generally range all the way from fiber optic cables to kind of data centers. And in principle, China has then extended at least almost about $500 million in terms of kind of aggregate loans to Kenya around these systems. But in my particular focus, I focus on that $100 million that's been extended to Kenya to develop the kind of mass surveillance infrastructure. And by that, I'm really discussing things like, say, for example, facial recognition systems, which are technologies that allow for the identification of a human face. And so the first thing that I kind of want to then discuss with you is kind of elucidating the nature of current research on this topic. And when you kind of focus on the literature on this topic, what is quite clear is that there's a great orientation towards better understanding, say, for example, Chinese diplomatic interests or, say, Chinese corporate reach in Africa. And those are obviously two important kind of lines of inquiry because they best explicate, say, for example, what are the diplomatic interests in mind that support Chinese interest and ambition in the proliferation of the kind of technologies. And similarly, there's a lot of attention to, say, Chinese corporate interests, and in particular, why they would kind of extend their kind of corporate footprint onto Africa. There's kind of limited research that actually looks, though, to kind of the demand side of the equation. That is to say, why are African stakeholders procuring these technologies? Why are they taking on the debt that is necessary in order to then procure and then best utilize these systems. And so a great degree of my own kind of personal research then looks into basically the demand side of this equation. And when you kind of look specifically into the Kenya case, what is clear is that these technologies are principally procured under the guise of resolving traditional development challenges and security challenges. So these technologies are construed under the, let's call it the rubric of security and development, trying to resolve what has been kind of a perennial challenge for at least the Kenyan state, which is that of challenges surrounding terror and crime. And this is kind of best indexed specifically by the kind of Westgate massacre. In that particular instance, unfortunately, about 67 or so people died that day when about 4 kind of Islamic terrorists from the group of Al-Shabaab walked into Westgate Mall, which is a mall in Westland, Nairobi. And within that particular instant, the police obviously were able to arrive onto the scene, and they claimed to be able to identify and track these individuals. But a lot of kind of later reporting, specifically both from kind of international partners, but also kind of domestic kind of journalists, revealed that the state actually was not able to identify all the perpetrators and was not particularly also able to track each of those individuals. And so that kind of created a security vacuum for the state. And so in order to try and resolve this general trepidation, it was then best believed that a surveillance infrastructure would allow them the capabilities of identifying and further surveilling these individuals. And so that's the context in which you then find the drive for a mass surveillance system. And now, in order to then establish that, you then have to work with kind of partners that allow you those technical capabilities. And it's a basic kind of very long story that I can't necessarily elaborate to you as to exactly how they arrived at working with Huawei. But initially, the contract was actually given to a local company, Safaricom, to basically roll out the adoption of the surveillance system. Obviously, Safaricom, as some of you might know, is basically like Kenya's equivalent of Verizon. It's a company that offers kind of telecommunication services that would allow for you to kind of get onto the internet, but also they offer you a kind of handheld cell phones, but they're most particularly famous for the kind of financial services app, which is kind of known as M-Pesa. This company, particularly at the time, was not working on surveillance technologies. And so in order to kind of get those capabilities, they had to basically partner with Huawei. Huawei then basically allowed them to establish a mass surveillance system across Nairobi. And by that, I mean about 1,800 surveillance cameras were kind of installed across Nairobi, and specifically 200 traffic surveillance technologies. These surveillance technologies were then also connected up to specifically 2 kind of command centers, which are basically, let's call them the brain nodes of your mass surveillance system that kind of installs kind of basically all the kind of surveillance cameras within the respective city. Those 2 kind of centers are then connected to about 195 police stations across the city, with the general expectation that they'll be able to reach about 9,000 police officers. So that's kind of the basic infrastructure. Now, of course, when you kind of establish such a capability, you then presume a technical competency within your police. And to do this, then the kind of Kenyan government with the police basically wanted sufficient training for their officers. And so they kind of sent them over to Beijing to kind of receive the requisite training. But an Auditor General's report revealed that while the police were sent to Beijing, they in fact did not receive the requisite training to actually, say, master the craft of actually leveraging the technology. Instead, they actually mostly spent their time auditing all the tools actually exported to Kenya. This had then resulted basically in a pattern of, let's say, technical dependency on their partner to support the maintenance and then application of the surveillance system over time. Simultaneously, it also then illustrated a general pattern of financial dependency on the partner in terms of the kind of requisite loans in order to maintain the system over time. But, you know, all of this would have been fine if the technologies, at the very least, produced the results that they were kind of procured under, which was help us reduce crime and cut kind of challenges surrounding terrorism. And unfortunately, the kind of, let's say, the causal linkage between kind of the adoption of mass surveillance and the truncation of crime isn't such a simple kind of line. Instead, the surveillance cameras, which were then claimed to be able to reduce crime, say, for example, which is a data point that was kind of repeated both by Huawei and then other partners, that they were able to cut crime by 46% in the neighborhoods supported by their surveillance technologies, is actually not backed up by any of the data. What you actually see what's going on the ground is that the surveillance technologies themselves have a kind of a more patchy quality of resolving the challenges surrounding both crime and terror. But what I kind of argue within my own personal work is that the general attention simply to this kind of conception of the technical fix, which is the introduction of a technical system to resolve a traditional social structural problem, like crime, actually obfuscates the broader variables that are included in challenges surrounding crime. So rather than thinking about, say, the basics of things like poverty, housing, and so forth, which are incredibly important variables in considering challenges surrounding crime, you disproportionately drew attention to a very expensive technical system that did not actually help you resolve these kind of traditional problems surrounding crime. And so my work then asks kind of critical questions about how we construe technical systems, particularly when they are being deployed under the guise of resolving fundamentally social political problems within a given politic, specifically in the context of Africa. And so I'll hold my kind of remarks there. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Yabo Wu. I just got my PhD from Maastricht University. My research interest lies in a lot of Chinese firms operating in the context of Kenya to work with the Chinese state, as well as a lot of local stakeholders in Kenya, like the Kenya government, as well as Kenya communities, to co-construct Chinese development cooperation. So today I'm going to share the work that intrigued me to pursue what I did for this working group. What I want to share today is some findings in my fieldwork about how Chinese technology firms, as transnational corporate actors, interpret and reproduce the China model in digital development within the context of Kenya. Well, I think of these questions because media discourse and political narratives from Western politicians, they warned people about the surveillance risks posed by Chinese informational technologies and Chinese companies for exporting surveillance technologies in Africa. Well, this kind of narratives are sided with scholars who argue that China's exportation of its authoritarian digital development or governance model occurs through the involvement of Chinese technology firms within digital development in Africa. Well, the collaboration among certain media, politicians, and scholars construct the perception of Chinese technology companies as state instruments, facilitating the state's agenda to expand authoritarian digital development. Well, from my point of view, these existing debates have either streamlined or centralized the China model, often focusing solely on advancing authoritarianism, or neglected the intricate interactions of Chinese firms with diverse actors within the host environment. I intend to use my inquiry to move beyond the state-centric discussions on exporting the China model and shed light on nuances on the complexities in this process that involves diverse corporate actors situated in the host context of an African economy. Well, the discussions of the exportation of the China model have not sufficiently dialogued with diverse interpretations of the China model. Exporting authoritarianism is definitely a very dominant narrative. This narrative has been built upon scholars highlight state control and state interest in steering digital development. They pinpoint that state builds up and that means the Chinese state builds up an intricate and fast-acting filtering regime with substantial technical, financial, and human resources to block internet access to unwanted content, especially in opposition to transnational private sector-based governance institutions and denationalized liberalism. The capacity of state control, as per some scholars, has been largely strengthened based on physical digital infrastructure, such as on-street cameras and huge investment in cutting-edge digital technologies. But large technology firms are seen as subject to state control due to strict licensing and market entry restrictions. This narrative, however, cannot have a dialogue with scholars who have demonstrated that the tolerant and supportive environment in China allows big technology firms to autonomously explore social niches. Well, the later group of studies highlight that the function of post hoc regulations kind of create the tolerant environment, and those collaborations between the state and firms secure the success of Chinese technology sector. Well, my investigation also benefits from studies that interpret the multifaceted involvement of diverse actors and relational dynamics in the exportation of the China model. For example, African elites have been proven to extract the strong state from China when they attempt to build up the authority or emphasize self-dependence when contending the Western-led norms and rules. Well, my highlight of the roles of firms in exporting the China model in digital development, dialogues with scholars who find that Chinese state-owned and private technology firms run their own business networks with host governmental telecom agencies, local private entities, and financial institutions in host countries. For example, Gagliardon scrutinizes the practices of Chinese technology firms in 4 African countries and asserts that these companies pragmatically please partners rather than behave due to a calculated state strategy. Therefore, Chinese companies are entangled within host technopolies built by local networks of technologies, discourses, and actors, and therefore support African nations' own idea of digital development. Well, my research involves 2 Chinese companies which have diverse forms of embeddedness in Kenya's digital development. The first is a really large private company that has involved in Kenya's some very basic infrastructure, digital infrastructure projects. Well, in their really intricate daily operations, I think the most significant elements that manifest the China model would be their emphasis on the element of respecting internet sovereignty. Well, for this company, what I learned from the interviews are that they are facing the environment of like a kind of like a very envisionalized, very the Kenya government that has like strong state envisions for like how to do digital development and how to work with international partners. And so in this case, they want to build up some kind of new characteristics to their brand. And this kind of emphasizing for internet sovereignty is linked with some practical elements. So that's what one Kenyan official mentioned, that when competing with Western counterparts, this company emphasized that they're gonna store data in Kenya instead of transfer this data to clouds that's located in Europe or in US due to the need to cut price. So that's kind of the elements also kind of build up the senses of officials in the Kenya government about the sense of control and ownership over the facility. Well, the second case is a small startup private company that starts to do internet services in Kenya's middle and low income urban communities. Well, I think the most significant part of the China model is when they not to help people to get access to internet. Is something happened when they started to develop e-commerce businesses. So when they do that, they kind of want to learn from China's already established e-commerce platforms to build a localized logistics system. And this system is something like kind of always exists in debates about how Jingdong, a Chinese e-commerce platform, successfully built their networks that bypassing the existing post system and secured timely deliveries back in China. However, to do this, this company also do a lot of adaptations, such as they involve a lot of local boda or bicycle cyclists to do the timely delivery. Also, in doing of the e-commerce, they are facing the community environment that a lot of households don't want to do a lot of large quantity purchase, but want to do some daily purchase. But that's going to cost a very significant increase of the cost if they deliver like really small packages. So they instead they work closely with community shops to help them to do this kind of e-commerce in this community. Well, so from these two cases, I conclude three forward conclusion remarks. So first, Chinese private technology firms are primarily commercial-oriented entities, flexibly adapt to their environment in Kenya. From their perspective, they are distant from being agents of the state to export the Chinese authoritarian digital development model. Second, for interpreting China's digital development model, these firms deviate from government actors that primarily collapse around market governance. They mostly extract successful business operations from China's digital development trajectory. For example, regarding like how to serve the firm, how to deal with the expansion of their e-commerce business. Regarding exportation, these firms transnationally reproduce Chinese experience contingent on the Kenya context. It dialogues with studies emphasize Kenya agency, which combines state envisioned and facilitated transformations, and active civil society co-participation in digital transformation. The first firm just grasps the priority of the Kenya government to establish government ownership and leadership. So they swiftly construct a brand feature around internet sovereignty. The second company takes experience of how a Chinese e-commerce platform has built businesses on the unique logistics system and adapts the system to the nascent community market in Kenya with special environmental conditions and consumption habits. So I will hold my speech for today. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Yabo. Good morning, everybody. I'd first like to say a big thank you to our conveners of the project, Prof. Anita, Prof. Yun, and Prof. Ken, and the research project assistant, Brennan, for, organizing all the logistics, bringing us over, flying us from across different parts of the world. It's been great. Yesterday was especially great and very intellectually stimulating. Got some great ideas for the research paper. So as Prof. Anita mentioned, my name is Mandira Bagwandin. I'm affiliated with Stellenbosch University, where I teach political economy and international relations, specializing or largely focusing on the global South, specifically Africa. My presentation today is titled Huawei, Helping or Hindering African Countries Secure Their Data Sovereignty. I'm going to try to keep things quite simple because there's several concepts that are quite complex. And what I'll first start off doing is outlining how African countries, and this is a big generalization. I haven't managed to look at all 54 African countries, but just how generally African countries are conceptualizing and understanding digital sovereignty, data sovereignty, and in a way, conflating data localization and digital sovereignty. And I'll be zoning in on the kind of the hype, or I'd say the trend of developing in-house, in-country data centers with the help of the US's not in the US's good books kind of company, Huawei. And I'll touch a bit on Senegal. And I think Ibrahima might have a few comments, being from Senegal, that he'd probably add on in his presentation. So just to begin, kind of lay the context very briefly. As the region, as Africa as a continent digitizes, data sovereignty has become a key issue. What we've seen across various kind of news reports and headlines in the tech sector is that several African countries are investing in data centers to reduce their dependence on foreign states, notably the US and Europe, for processing and storing data, and in a way attempting to mitigate data colonialism. Now, Huawei, which is not in, as I mentioned, the US's good books for several reasons, notably, its potential to kind of breach kind of digital assets and compromise national security, has positioned itself as a key data center provider in the region. And its representatives have publicly and on several occasions advocated the company's willingness to help African countries achieve data sovereignty and in turn digital sovereignty. I think before proceeding any further, I think it's quite important to just kind of get a simple understanding of these two concepts, because this would help, I think, help put the puzzle pieces together a bit later on in my presentation. So how do we understand these two concepts? Very simply, I'm not going to go into, the very the kind of semantics or the very kind of complex ways you could understand it. Just very simply put, data sovereignty refers to this idea or concept that data is subject to the laws and regulations and governance of a country or region where it is collected, processed, or stored. So think a bit of it like a country's control over its physical borders and resources, and in a way extend this concept to the digital realm. And then digital sovereignty kind of comprises data sovereignty in that it refers to the ability of a country to have control over their digital assets, data, infrastructure, and it encompasses the power to make decisions, or the state to make decisions about the collection, storage, and processing of digital information, as well as the hardware and software that is used. So looking now, bringing it back to how African countries generally are understanding digital sovereignty. So what I've seen and read is that, like China's state-centric approach to digital sovereignty, many African countries are drawing a parallel between digital sovereignty and data localization, believing that to exercise digital sovereignty, greater control over data, ICT infrastructure, and all data processing activities must occur within territorial borders. Resultingly, and if we're following this logic, so what we're seeing is that data center projects are popping up across the continent, with some countries, such as my own, South Africa, designating them as critical infrastructure, critical information infrastructure that should be treated and protected as national assets. So this conflation of digital sovereignty with data localization is due to governments seeking, or due to the state trying to position the state as the arbiter of digital and cyber governance. And although data localization is considered a means to ensure data sovereignty, it's not easy to achieve in Africa because of the kind of enormous capital required and the financial investments. Also, you need a lot of technical capacity and abilities and access to basic power infrastructure. So electricity is needed to build and deploy these data centers. And given these challenges, many African governments look to international companies and financial institutions to develop data center projects. So now Huawei has an extensive presence across the continent. It's almost Huawei ICT infrastructure is the backbone of the continent. 3G, 4G, now even 5G. Cloud computing services, Bulelani we discussed that yesterday. It has a very expansive presence across, I think it has offices now across 25 countries, and the number is going to keep growing. And so it just seemed like with this, its embedded kind of presence and kind of having developed this reputation as, a kind of digital partner for the continent, it just seemed like Huawei has positioned itself to really be at the forefront of developing data centers for African countries. And of course, with all the controversy surrounding Huawei tech, there's some pros and cons to this. So I think that the pros is that it's kind of a one-stop shop for many African governments that want to build data centers. It delivers the hard infrastructure. It can deliver services associated to run that hard infrastructure, and as well with the help of Chinese policy banks, it offers favorable financing packages. The cons are, especially in the last couple of years, coming out of mostly US and allied countries is this kind of I would say campaign or narrative that Huawei, Huawei products and Huawei infrastructure poses national security risks in the form of, using backdoors and infrastructure to access sensitive data, national data and stuff. And what we've seen in Africa, in the region especially, there have been Chinese-related kind of cyber espionage incidents. We had spying in the AU headquarters, reports that Kenyan Chinese hackers or groups hacked Kenyan government ICT infrastructure to determine how they going to repay loans. So there are also issues around that, as well as data privacy, because of the laws in China mean that companies, if the government wants to, it can compel companies to hand over data to them. But I think overall, just pragmatism and rationalism around affordability, and again, with this aim of achieving digital sovereignty, it just necessitates African governments to lean more towards Huawei than Western providers. So just nearing towards the kind of case study part of it is that in June 2021, Senegal was the first country to replicate China's data governance model, requiring all servers to be housed within the country's borders. So to do this, with a loan from China Exim Bank of about $18 million, and with partnering with Huawei, it developed the Diamaniado National Data Center. And the president himself explicitly linked this project to guaranteeing Senegalese digital sovereignty. And he ordered that all data housed overseas must to be repatriated back to Senegal. And many other countries have followed suit, including Tanzania, South Africa, Nigeria, Ghana, Egypt, Kenya, and Cameroon. They have established these data centers or are in the process of doing so. And most of them, if not all of them, have partnered with Huawei. So I think my final point is, I think the overall point I wanted to make with this is that as African countries, and I think we will for quite a long time, continue to rely on foreign companies, whether it be Huawei or others, for ICT developments, and especially for data related infrastructure and services, there'll always be concern about potential national cybersecurity breaches by foreign entities, because until we can be in the position to have African built data centers where we can control the processes, the kind of infrastructure, we'll always be at the kind of the mercy of the foreign company, because whether it's Huawei, Samsung, Nokia, Ericsson, they will ultimately have the control over the infrastructure, and unbeknownst to many of us, could, have these implement backdoors to these data centers to access data. So I think achieving absolute digital sovereignty, and it's in its truest form, for most African countries will remain a pipe dream.
Okay. So thank you, everyone. My name is Ibrahim Manyang. I'm from Dakar, Senegal, Cheikh Anta Diop University. I'm a sociologist. Before I present my paper, I would like also to thank the organizer by bringing all of us here in Georgetown University to share our research and to go deeper on what we are doing on Africa, China, research on geopolitical, digitals, and ICT research. So as you may know, I'm from a French-speaking country. I will try to do my best concerning my presentations, which is titled China Huawei Group and the Building in Senegalese Digital Grammar, how the new Senegalese project called New Deal Technology, can this project will fit in terms of sovereignty with the relation that we have with Huawei. So I for my paper I use the historical démarche to better understand in the long run the evolution of Senegalese digital strategy. Because for me, as a sociologist, I used to say that it is important to let people to know the evolution of the ecosystem, to understand the moment that we notice that there is a rupture, there is a changement on the evolution of the digital strategy in Senegal. So the purpose of my communication can be divided in two moments, because of even I say that we have to see, to analyze the evolution of the digital strategy in Senegal, but it is important to articulate it, this evolution around two key concepts: the concept of agency and the concept of sovereignty, because it comes in the debate, the two concepts. So that's why I would like also to let you know that how this relation has evaluated in the long run. In 2002, the Senegalese government has established a new state agency called ADEE to be, en fait, to lead all the Senegalese strategy in terms of digitalization, the administrations. So in January 2002, during the Abdoulaye Wade regime, the new e-Senegal visions was implemented. It was based on the conviction that ICT constitute an essential lever for a country's economic development. So the new economic conception paved the way for the State Information Technology Agency that was created in 2004. During the launch phase of the digital strategy of the Senegalese state, funding from the World Bank. This phase was called eGov Zero. eGov Zero was launched with the money from World Bank. And you will see that it will be evaluated from the time that the World Bank decided to support the Senegalese government on their digital strategy. And 2006, when Senegalese government decided to reestablish the relations with China, and in 2006, Huawei jumped on. And from that time, you will see that it will be evaluated on our digital strategy by collaborating with Huawei from 2006 to 2024. And we will have eGov 1, eGov 2, and eGov 3. eGov 3 should be considered as a kind of strategy which is linked to what we called Plan Sénégal Émergent, Senegalese Plan of Emergency. And for EGOV 3, you have Smart Senegal project. And Smart Senegal project, you have safe cities, Senegal Service, Senegal Smart Education. For all of these projects, which we gain funds from Chinese government, from China Exim Bank company, the Huawei Group leaded all of these projects. And you may know that on this project, we have the Smart Senegal strategy, which include the deployment of a large-scale fiber optic network spanning the entire country and interconnecting most of the public sector, facilitates a Tier 3 data center that my colleagues was talking. So in addition, the Senegalese service digital strategy focuses on the digitalization of administrative procedure by developing a national network of Senegalese service center to provide a one-stop digital shop for the delivery of administrative service in 45 regions of the country. The promotion of innovation through the creation of an innovation laboratory, the development of skills by setting up digital academy, the security of information systems. So the various phases of this turnkey project are financed by an Exim Bank loan from China to the Senegalese government. So I was saying at the beginning of my communication that I would like to articulate my presentation on two key concepts: agencies and sovereignty. So we have EGOV 0, funded by World Bank, and we moved to EGOV 1, EGOV 2, EGOV 3. All of these projects were funded by China Exim Bank. It's the People's Republic of China to the Senegalese government. And all of these programs were executed by Huawei Group. So we have 5 kilometers of optic fiber. We have the data center. We have also the cable, marine cable, and also the safe cities. So I will not talk much more on the safe city program. I think as all of my colleagues say that the Safe City is a program in Senegal which have 500 CCTV camera all around the country, and also 5 center of commandment to see what's happening on the streets, and if there is some riots, how the police will intervene. So coming to the concept of agency. So I was asking the director of the Senegal Numeric, which is the state-owned enterprises who are collaborating with Huawei. So where comes from the idea of having Smart Senegal? So for him, Smart Senegal is a kind of strategy from the government. But when I asked also the same question to one of his collaborators, he said that, Smart Senegal is something which is linked to Smart Africa. And I asked him, so Smart Senegal is linked to Smart Africa. And he said that the Chinese was there at the beginning of this idea, and they see that there is an opportunity for them to go with the African government who have their own smart project and they decided to join them and to give them the funds. So, and in terms of agency, I was asking them, so did you try to have your own idea concerning this project, or it's only a Chinese idea to try to reframe the digital grammar of Senegal? And they said that no, we try to redesign the Chinese proposition by having smart Senegal survive, because Senegal survive didn't exist on the Chinese proposition. Senegal Wi-Fi didn't exist on their proposition. And also concerning the data center, the Chinese initial proposition was only to put all of this data in a container, not to build a big building like what we have in Diamniadio, but having just a container to put all the stuff inside. So for them, it is a way that they didn't just take the Chinese proposal, they try to reframe it, to redesign it, to let the Senegalese authorities, by asking people in high education or people in the Ministry of Defense or the Army, what they think about how we can redesign the Chinese proposal. So I'm moving to the next steps, like talking to the Senegalese new New Deal technology. This is a new project launched by the new president called Bassirou Diomaye Faye. He visited China, and he was invited in Huawei companies to invited them how to join the New Deal technology. And also he moved from China to US to visit the Silicon Valley and meet some manager from Google, from NVIDIA and Starlink, like to propose them also to join the New Deal technology. So it comes to me to raise the question. So what is sovereignty? Because in many African leaders, they talk about sovereignty. What is sovereignty? Where the infrastructure of the digital comes from China and the software comes from US. What is the sovereignty in this context? What is the relevance of sovereignty in Africa? What is the relevance where you don't have the technology, you don't have the digital, the digital infrastructure comes from China and the software came from US. So I would like to finish on this point to say that the main point for me, which is very important, is digital trust. Like we have to build a digital trust in our world. So I would like to finish here and to thanks for your attention.
So much for your engaging paper. So we're going to open it up for a moderated Q&A. I'm not sure if we're taking questions from the online audience in the chat. I don't know if we have the capacity to do that, but I'll actually start off while folks in the audience are thinking of questions. So I'll start with Bulelani, and I'll just ask questions of each of you, and then we'll take questions from the audience. I'm curious to know how ordinary people are understanding and interpreting the it sounds like it's quite intense surveillance infrastructure that exists within Nairobi. I want to know what observations you've made and if that is included in your field research. So that's the first. For Yabo, I know you talk about, the Chinese model, but I couldn't help but think that another model is clearly emerging. So I was wondering if there are any possibilities of some co-created model that Chinese firms on the ground are are developing as they're interacting with Kenyan consumers. You know, is there something else emerging that firms or managers or Chinese companies that you engaged with, if there's anything unique happening that they've had to adapt to or respond to that they didn't expect, that has made them innovate in ways that they didn't anticipate? For Mandira, I'm very curious about the policy frameworks around sovereignty. I know globally, this is something that governments are trying to struggle with. You know, how do policy frameworks, which tend to be quite slow, with digital technologies moving so quickly, how do policies keep up with the rapidly changing technologies? And I'm just curious to know if there are any global structures, any global institutions moving conversations along, and where Africa is, where African countries are placed in those global discussions, if they're happening. I don't know if Africa is at the forefront or if African nations are at the table. And if the African Union, if any conversations are happening at that level, or if there are any individual African nations that are actually ahead of the global community in terms of thinking about data sovereignty in any interesting ways that could be empowering to people. And then Ibrahima, I was wondering, in terms of agency, you know, it's very complicated. If we were thinking about agency in terms of governments working in the interests, ideally, of their people, right? In the interests of their constituents, do you think, you know, the pragmatism of, you know, visiting Silicon Valley, you know, visiting Europe, visiting, you know, companies in East Asia, are these strategies allowing the Senegalese government to effectively deliver for constituents, right? Is it effective in terms of service delivery, in terms of, you know, ICT infrastructure? Have they been successful or not? I don't know if you're quite there in terms of your research, but, you know, just on the citizen level, I think it's similar to my question for Bulelani. Are people feeling that their governments are delivering in terms of ICT infrastructure? Because at the end of the day, you know, people have to feel like their governments are working for them. So if it's Huawei or another company, if people feel like, hey, you know, I feel like I have reliable, fast internet service that's affordable, I can't complain, you know, my government's delivering. Or is that not the case? Or maybe it's more complicated. So maybe you'll take this round and then we'll take the next round from the audience. And I'll ask Brendan if we can take questions from the audience.
Great. So to kind of repeat the question I was asked about, how do people feel about surveillance? So in order to kind of conduct my research, I principally rely mostly on mixed methods approaches that both kind of leverage archival, ethnographic, and at times statistical methods to better kind of understand the nature of facial recognition systems and their general application in the context of Kenya. And so this particular round of research relies on ethnographic work that I did for about 14 months. And within that time, I did spend a good amount of time really trying to better understand kind of surveillance's impact on questions around citizenship. And in particular, what you found is that there was a general range of sentiments surrounding surveillance. At one end, you would find a kind of everyday person's position on surveillance as, you know, a modality that will resolve traditional challenges that sit at the intersection of development and public safety. And so you'll hear comments like, you know, I'm not particularly sure whether or not the surveillance tools, you know, are really solving crime, but I'm just happy that they're there because they might deter crime. At another level, you will hear comments like, I just know that the surveillance cameras are here for the bad guys, but I'm not necessarily always sure that they're catching the bad guys because I still feel like crime's a problem in this city. And at the other end, you'll kind of hear sentiments of really kind of deep trepidation over surveillance. And in particular, I was struck by several kind of conversations that I had with Uber drivers across the city, who, by the way, I believe are actually the best positioned to speak about the general infrastructure of the city, in part because they experience the infrastructure of the city in the everyday ways of kind of driving across the city. And one particular driver told me that, he's aware that the cameras are working, but they consistently look down and they never really look up, which is to say that like the surveillance camera in itself does not have a ubiquitous gaze, i.e., it does not see everything. It is a kind of a structurally contingent way of making observations about a respective kind of space. And so its kind of spatially defined nature means that it does not necessarily capture everything. And what he was pointing towards is that, while the camera is maybe able to make identifications of everyday people, it does not necessarily catch all the criminals that he sees in his country. And in particular, he was gesturing towards politicians who he believes are also implicated in crime, but the surveillance cameras are not in their offices. And so the question about whether or not crime is being resolved becomes a question about, well, which crime are you looking for? And what happens when you introduce a technical system that is precisely contingent on assuming that all crimes are taking place on the ground and not necessarily always taking place in say, offices or in meetings? And in a particular context where at times the possibility of the future is contingent on, say, public service, and public service is greatly challenged by kind of systemic corruption, became a kind of a thing that I was kind of wrestling with in terms of the nature of how one thinks about crime in Kenya. Yeah.
Thank you, Anita, for this interesting question. If I understand correctly, you are asked that whether there's like some certain level of consensus among Chinese firms about the China model.
No, I was wondering if there could be a different model, because what Chinese firms are experiencing on the ground may be different from the Chinese model, right? If that exists, there may be something very different happening because they're engaging with different communities and experiencing different things.
Well, yeah, I think, well, to this question, yeah, I think they are running like totally different models because they are facing like very different contexts, very different environments. However, that's one thing. However, they are also transnational actors. So when they develop like business strategies, or when they interact with local actors, they also try to draw wisdom or draw experience from their previous experience. Even though if the company hiring some newly graduate students to start business there, they need to learn what's already exists for this firm, and they develop from there. So even though they are developing like different kinds of models, different kind of strategies to really fit into the context, we can also trace us back to a lot of existing experience for the firms when they developed from China, or if this is like a new start firms in Kenya, they can also learn from those big tech giants that share their business strategies, business experience. So yeah, there are definitely different models, but this models can also trace back to what happened before. Yeah.
Thanks, Anita, for your question. So I expected this to come up because there seems to be around digital advancement, development, and associated issues of data privacy, regulations, governance, there seems to be kind of this, for lack of a better phrasing, I'd say a kind of a hodgepodge approach from African countries. So what we're seeing is that we're seeing African countries, again, from the general perspective, understanding digital sovereignty similarly to China, taking a very state-centric approach. But then around the regulatory side, we're seeing African governments and countries draw on EU regulations, such as the General Data Protection Regulation Act. So it's almost like there's this disconnect. We understanding and conceptualizing that the state should be at the center of really controlling the infrastructure and data, but then we are still want to maintain kind of some individuality in terms of how our data is protected, not having the state compel companies to give them data, or having regulations in place that means, you know, you kind of just siphoning off data to anyone that can buy it as well. So there's these two kind of, so we're not entirely in terms of going the Chinese model of digital governance, but we're really emphasizing the sovereignty aspect of it, and that the state should be the arbiter of our digital governance, of kind of having the control of the infrastructure, so to speak. But then around the data, we're looking at the EU and how they're managing or governing data, specifically focusing largely on the individual or people, and not kind of creating this barrier between what can be shared with governments and how much reach the government can have, and companies as well. And so there's this kind of almost this hodgepodge approach, again, drawing from one country and drawing from another, the EU bloc. And then when we look at the continental level and looking at the AU, I think three policies almost encapsulate these two approaches. The three policies are the Digital Transformation Strategy, 2020 to 2030, and this emphasizes Africa's ownership of modern digital management tools. Then there's the AU Data Policy Framework. Again, this emphasizes the necessity of independent and effective data protection authorities and promoting policies to ensure data sovereignty. And then there's the AU Convention on Cybersecurity and Data Protection, more commonly known as the Malabo Convention. And with all these three, you see there's this drive towards really having a continental framework that hopefully member countries would look towards in terms of fashioning their own national policies on data regulation. But you see aspects of how we're understanding data sovereignty based on the Chinese conception of it, and how we're understanding how data sovereignty and data governance should be achieved, looking at the best practices, so to speak, from the EU. And so it's quite interesting that at that continental level, those kind of ideas and concepts coming from the two different places are reflected in these documents as well. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Anita, for your question. So before coming to answer your question in terms of delivery, I am a little bit, I am very doubtful concerning the eGov project, because for me, we have to audit all of this project to see whether they are efficiency or not, because it should be enable the Senegalese government to become, autonomous in terms of reducing the bill of phone, reducing the bill of internet. But till now, they are using the mobile the private mobile operator for phoning and also for internet. So you receive money, loans from Chinese government. The contract is executed by Huawei. But at the end, I think it is not really impactful on if we analyze the purpose of all of these projects. And during my last interview with the former director, he was saying me that there are material which should be outdated if we didn't use this material, if we didn't try to lease this material to the private operator. It means that, the private operator, they are working with Huawei. The Senegalese government also are working with Huawei. And even we have 6,000 of kilometers of optic fiber, it didn't work what it should work. It means that we have to, to audit all of this program to see whether it is impactful or not. So going to the questions, like in terms of delivery, yeah, even in now, the Senegalese government has created a kind of agency that they call delivery unit, because of there is, some problems during the contract that they have with Huawei in terms of, respecting the deadline. There is many problem on that they didn't respect the deadline. So that's why they have created the delivery unit agency. So trying to diversify the partnership, I think it is important for the new government to see the possibility that they have and try to balance the way of Huawei, and to invite other group like NVIDIA, Google, and to join their new strategy. I think maybe it will affect the digital strategy of our government. So I hope I did.
You did.
Okay, thank you.
Are there any questions from the audience? Will you please introduce yourself?
Hi, thank you very much for your talk. My name is Yijing Shen, and I'm a first-year graduate student at Georgetown University, majoring in Asian Studies. So I think our previous question is about another alternative model. So I previously read a news reporting on how India is trying to export its digital payment services to a lot of African countries in a more open way. And the news I report is kind of compared the China model and the Indian model, to frame India as a rather good alternative compared to the China one. So I'm very curious about your perspective on India's role. Is it more regarded as a very effective and helpful way for African countries, or it's more just to frame India as an ally and China as an adversary from a US perspective? Thank you very much.
Wait, is it okay if we take a few questions?
Okay.
And then you all take more? Are there any more from the in-person audience? Okay, then we'll take some from online.
Yeah, hi, thank you so much. I think it's really an important perspective from Africa into her about the digital governance. And my name is Iverson Yue. I'm a first-year graduate student, study communication, culture, and technology. So my research focus is on digital technology governance or cyber governance. So my question is, as I was studying cyber governance, understand how digital infrastructures is important for national security, data security, and digital sovereignty. So, as you all mentioned, this question could be for anyone. Almost all the project for infrastructures are funded by Chinese government, led by Chinese firms, Huawei. How challenging is that to build digital sovereignty based on Chinese infrastructures? What I'm trying to ask is what measures can be taken to technically achieve the thing you called the independence or the individuality based on Chinese infrastructure. So I'm wondering how. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Bronson. I'm an economics student, not here. I very much enjoyed hearing about all the work you guys are doing to help our society keep up with all the technology changes that we're facing. And what I would love to get your input on is with regards to data sovereignty, in order to achieve that, you guys mentioned it is important to have education of local people to be able to maintain and improve the system. To what extent are African governments investing in the education, and what can be done to make it better? Thank you.
So I'd say let's go ahead and answer the in-person questions, and we'll move on to the virtual ones.
I can start. Cool. Okay, great. I can start. Let's start with this kind of question of India, and then maybe I'll speak to questions about dependency, and then finally, I think there's a question a bit about human capital. At least as it relates to the question of India, it is partly true that India is trying to also extend its digital footprint to Africa, principally thinking about its kind of comparative advantage related to kind of software. But the problem with that kind of narrative, again, is that it principally just stages Africa as a kind of, say, staging ground for geopolitical players, where, again, Africa functions more so as a theater for the political expression of will of others outside of the continent, rather than construing African actors as the kind of principal agents within their own realm and within their own kind of body to kind of determine general outcomes. And so while I generally welcome an interest in India to Africa, it's also partly important to not let the narratives kind of construe Africa as another kind of new Cold War theater. And I think in part the kind of conversation we're trying to have here today is partly to think about as how do we problematize these narratives precisely for the purposes of centering kind of African, both voices, but more importantly, kind of African action on the geopolitical stage. And in terms of kind of questions of dependency, what is interesting about, I'd say, all forms of kind of digital infrastructure is that there's some degree of dependency wherever you look. You know, there are very few, say, kind of technical or vertical stacks that don't necessarily import technical systems from elsewhere. So the question is not necessarily about how can you become completely independent of others. It's more so about what kind of dependencies are you willing to live with, and how do you then accrue the necessary infrastructure that engenders the sufficient trust to ensure that those systems over time will offer kind of mutual aid and benefit. And so it's really less about complete independence. It's more so about how do you ensure that the kind of dependencies you have do not truncate your own individual will and volition in kind of making the futures you want possible. And so that's kind of where I would go with at least the discourses of dependency and independence. And then as it relates to the kind of question of human capital, you know, one of the challenges of kind of delivering on the promises of technology is at one level, it can be a kind of a technical question, do you have the sufficient infrastructure? And that issue is generally resolved by taking on further debt. But then obviously resolving that issue is greatly contingent on investing on human capital. And so that's kind of been a kind of a growing call kind of across the kind of the sites that I work with in terms of ensuring there's adequate investment in human capital. And funny enough, the last project that I was actually involved in Kenya was about Huawei's kind of growing commitments in investing in Kenyan human capital, specifically in kind of engineering talent. Now, whether or not that engineering talent remains on the continent is another kind of set of questions. The issue in Africa is not that usually there's not enough talent on the continent. It's usually that talent, usually once it is well maturated, it leaves the continent and kind of ends up in Silicon Valley. And so our kind of huge challenge for the continent is how do we ensure that the talent that is trained domestically also works for the kind of domestic interests?
Well, I guess I can respond a little bit to the comparison between Indian model and China model. So I think when I actually approach to China model, I find like there's no very strong consensus about what the China model really is, and I think that could also happen to the Indian model. Well, for discussions about what kind of models is better, it really comes from really need to see who's really arguing this kind of stuff. Like different people have different perspectives, and for corporations in today's globalized world, well, probably facing a lot of challenging right now, but for them like deeply embedded in the supply chain that is very globalized, it's really hard to say that they're gonna have some very unique equipment, or they can get rid of like products or segments from like part of the equipment from other nations. So I think what those Kenya government or like Senegal government appreciate Chinese firms is their flexibility to really adapt to what they want and to have certain level of negotiations, and also largely because they can provide really cheap equipment and service plans for them, and also come with the potential Chinese finance resources. So yeah, that's my response to this. And also I think a little bit to like, is there any measurements to really help us to understand the independence? Well, I think it's really hard. For now, the independence from the perspective of a lot of African politicians is to keep data within the continent, within their own territory, or have like more control over the facility that they hire their own staff trained either from Western world or from China or domestically to run this system. But when it comes to whether they can really understand the equipment, or they can what kind of cooperation models they have with different partners, that's something needs to be further investigated from my perspective. Thank you.
I think with regards to the first question, looking at you used the phrase Indian open payment system. Is this around e-commerce? Okay. And then the Chinese payment system. I think overall, it doesn't really matter which payment system we use. It depends on African governments and how they kind of the rules and regulations they put in place. So whether we use a US payment system, whether we use Indian, French, whichever one, what laws and protections are we putting in place? I think, as Bulelani was mentioning, not to get caught up in the kind of techno-geopolitical commentary coming out, especially from Washington. For us from the global, mostly from African global South, we look at it both ways, right? We look at, okay, what can China offer? What can India offer? What can Brazil offer? We're looking at what can be offered, and how I think the power or the African agency perspective should never get lost in the techno-geopolitical commentary. I find when I read a lot of the commentary coming out of most Western countries is that we're just this testing ground, and we don't have agency in shaping deals or in shaping outcomes. And I think if you're a scholar or researcher here, your work would be much richer if you put that filter on and sift through the kind of I'd say the rhetoric that's constantly being put out there. Again, keeping in mind there's the techno-geopolitical narratives framing techno-nationalism, we're better than the Chinese, so keep that all in mind, because it would help, I think, give you a more nuanced perspective on the role of the global South and why we're choosing to act beyond the ideologies of democracy and open governance, but why China, why Huawei? I think I often find, not to be offensive, but take a step down from the moral pedestal a bit. And I think it would be fascinating to see why African governments are making the choices they're making. Sometimes there's just no alternative. Financially, can't match those prices. And if you want African governments to use more Western suppliers or Western kind of companies, then give us a better offer. Okay. The other one around human capital, again, it depends, I think, which countries you look at. So in South Africa, we have all our universities and things have computer engineering courses, and whereas if you look at countries like Malawi, maybe not so much. Again, there is this focus, and South Africa has a huge digital focus, capacity focus. Again, I'm I'd say I can't pinpoint specific documents at the top of my head, but there is, and it depends on which countries you look at. But also in terms of Huawei, why again, Huawei is so attractive is because it does have these kind of soft, or we'd say these talent programs or generating local talent. But then again, the big question is, do we keep that? How do we maintain that? And then around the issue of, tech sovereignty, or given that we're so reliant on Chinese infrastructure, I'm again bringing it back to African agency. Are we ensuring that we're monitoring the infrastructure? Are we sending technicians or getting technicians from other countries to come and double check that, we're safe or we're not being spied on? So again, just always bring it back to that.
Okay, thank you. We're going to take 2 more questions, and we're going to ask that only one person answer each of the questions, and they're both from online. Brennan, take it away.
Yeah, so we have our first question from Raquel Jones, who's senior computer science major from Buffalo, New York, attending Howard University. I think this one's directly for Yabo. He said, I just wanted to understand more about the policies between the government and private Chinese data firms like Huawei. Are there any regulations against manipulating or selling data like the issues we had in America with Facebook/Meta? And then the next question, more general one from Felix Adouar from the University of Nairobi, Kenya. He says, my concern is effective technology transfer to halt technical dependency, which leads to minimalization of financial dependency and maintaining the operation of these technologies. What are some of the recommendations that the first presenter could provide? I'm not sure who the first presenter is, but these...
But anyone can answer, so okay. Very quickly.
Oh, yeah. Okay, go ahead.
And then can you help me to like repeat the question again?
Yeah, of course. So he wants to understand more about the policies between the government and private Chinese data firms like Huawei. Are there any regulations against manipulating or selling data similar to the issues we've had in the US, like with Facebook?
Oh, that's Raquel's question with Meta in terms of selling data. Are you an expert on that? Can anyone talk about the issue of selling data?
I'm not like an expert on this, but from my interviewees, I think, well, that's from the perspective of firms. They said they don't have this kind of deals with either of the, I mean, they have the deal with the Kenya government that they need to like keep data inside Kenya government, and they don't have any like there's no business motives for them to do this, to have like deeper cooperation with Chinese government to have this kind of thing. So I guess that speaks a little bit, but as for like regulations or like more specific details in this kind of issue, that I'm not an expertise in this. So yeah.
Yeah, sure. So in terms of technology transfers, this has generally been construed as a kind of a quick fix for perennial kind of technical dependency. And generally, there's been a kind of a growing both body of literature, but also general emphasis from practitioners to generally ensure that there are clauses that will allow for tech transfers when they're working with, say, Chinese partners or really kind of any exogenous partners from the continent. The general challenge, though, is with technology transfers is, again, having the domestic capacity to actually do the tech transfers. And what you generally find, both from Chinese companies, but also really any partners, is almost a willingness to comply, but not a willingness to support you in directly onboarding the technical capacity domestically. And that partly has to do with the fact that there is no immediate incentive from the partner to basically give you the IP. But also domestically, there's been a general challenge surrounding building domestic capacity to onboard these new both kind of technical skills, but also kind of human capacity skills in the long term. And so I do partly, agree with the sentiments that like, better tech transfers would try and alleviate the challenge of technical dependency in the long term. But simultaneously, we also have to think about both about what is the responsibility of kind of the corporate partner, but domestically also what are people necessarily doing to ensure that like once you have the clauses of kind of tech transfers, what capacities would you have to ensure that there's an onboarding of those skills and ensuring that those skills, they say democratically distributed also across your society and not simply kind of held within kind of small groups and communities.
Thank you so much. Another round of our applause for our expert panel.